Welcome, everyone. For those of you joining us, I'd like to invite, because we're in a big room, for folks to come forward, because we're going to have a bit of a hybrid resource sharing and conversation. And so I'd like to have that conversation space be a little more approachable, and a little more of an intimate space. So it'd be great if you can come in closer to the chairs here that we have set up, just to create a little bit more of an intimate space. But thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to be talking about the relational science model. This is a tool that's really useful for all researchers that are interested in approaches to help them move away from extractive research processes and paradigms towards community-driven science. And so I'm going to unpack what this is and what it looks like more as we kind of move through the session. But it's basically going to be a hybrid where I'm going to demonstrate some tools and strategies and examples and resources that you can use as you come out of this session going forward when you're working with local or indigenous communities in a research process or a project. And then it's going to give you those tools, and we're going to talk about some strategies, and then we're going to also have it sort of be a hybrid conversation. So we have this conversation circle here that Connie, who's joining me, and we will introduce ourselves shortly, is going to help facilitate. Okay, so the other thing I want to say is that I've seen many examples of really great collaborative projects throughout this conference so far. And so a lot of you are already doing this work and doing it really well. And so I really invite you and encourage you to share those experiences.
Just a quick note. Hello, can you hear me? Quick note that you can scan that QR code to access our materials. There will be many tools there.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. Appreciate that, Connie. Yeah, so that, I'd suggest scanning that QR code. We have the slides, and also some papers I'm going to reference, and some other resources, all in this link here. So I'll have it up other times. Before we do, I just want to briefly highlight our learning objectives for this session. First, we're going to identify the core pillars of this relational science model that I'll introduce you to. We're going to apply Indigenous data sovereignty principles to conservation technology projects, identify protocols for co-developing ethical research agreements, and navigate power dynamics of co-production. So that's where we're headed. A little bit before we dive in, I want to acknowledge that the conference takes place on the traditional homelands of the Wari and Tiwanaku peoples, among other nations, whose enduring activities reflect profound relationships with land, governance, and knowledge systems, and continue to shape the Andean world today. Another thing I wanted to introduce myself briefly, so I'm Sarah Bombachi. I am an associate professor at Colorado State University, and I work on a lot of projects that intersect with this conference, so bioacoustics, soundscape ecology, a lot of human-wildlife coexistence work, conservation technology, and then community-centered conservation, which is really what this session's about. And I look for innovative solutions to conserving diversity while meeting diverse human needs. And then I'll have Connie introduce herself, who's co-facilitating.
Hello, everyone. I am Connie Arevalo. I'm a PhD student at Colorado State University, where my research takes a more community-based approach to wildlife monitoring. So I'm collaborating with a community in the Araucanía region of southern Chile. And this is a community that manages a private protected area. So together we are co-developing a wildlife monitoring program that uses bioacoustics that this community will be able to maintain in the long term. So today, Sarah will be presenting lots of great information and tools about how we can best collaborate with Indigenous and local communities. And mixed into all of this, we'll have a few discussions using that fishbowl format that you can see up here. It won't look exactly like this today, since it is a very large room. So traditionally, there's an inner circle and an outer circle. Today, our inner circle will be this semicircle, and our outer circle will be the chairs where you are all at right now. So how this will work is we will put some questions up here. We will go through them together. You'll have time to kind of process them, and then we'll invite some people to join me up here, and we'll have a nice, intimate discussion. And once you've said what you need to say, we would invite you to go back to your original seat, and then someone new to come up. So we should have a nice flow of people, a good conversation going, hopefully. Let me see. Oh, if anyone is not comfortable coming up here, we do invite you to use the Whova app, where you can submit any questions, thoughts that you might have. And if you haven't done this already, it's pretty easy to access. You just go into today's session in the agenda, open that up, and there should be a Q&A button that you can type whatever you want into. Yes, thank you. Okay, so for a few workshop norms so that we can keep today's communication nice and respectful, let me read through these. So, in the outer circle, please listen to understand the speaker's perspectives, so keep an open mind. If you enter the inner circle, or semicircle, to contribute, please rotate back to the outer circle once your points are made to keep the dialogue fluid. Ground your contributions in I statements and specific observations to keep the science relational and authentic. Allow a breathing gap between speakers to process complex ideas before the next person speaks. And build on others' ideas with credit and avoid scientific jargon so that we can ensure that knowledge remains accessible to all.
Okay, thank you, Connie. So with those logistics covered, I want to briefly introduce the relational science model. So this was developed by a colleague of mine, Dr. David Chavez, and colleagues who I work with closely. And the goal of the, I'm going to say RSM, it's a bit less of a mouthful, is to move away from extractive research paradigms to community-driven and accountable science. And so it centers the 4 indigenous values that you can see at the center of the spiral here of respect, integrity, reciprocity, and humility. And it frames relationships both as a method and an outcome in research collaboration. So relationships aren't just a means to get data, they are actually the result of the work. And we've actually included a copy of this paper in your workshop materials folder, that when I gave you the QR code, it will pop up again. And again, just to say, I've already seen a lot of projects here where people are implementing these practices, so it's great to see that energy. But what I love about this model is it is truly a framework that provides the tools. Sometimes people approach this from a high level and don't have sort of the nuts and bolts of how do I actually do this? How do I actually work with indigenous communities? What are the practices and actions that I should be thinking about taking? And that's what's great about this, is it really provides that framework, that roadmap, those set of tools and resources. And so the other paper I want to introduce you to, so I worked with several folks and we implemented this with a community and evaluated the success of that project. And I don't have time to go into every detail of the paper, but the link is there. It's also in the resources that I shared in that QR code. But we implemented this with a community in Guatemala, and we basically drew from the RSM to put this into practice and evaluate. Also, it draws on the approach that we took, and the RSM framework draws on the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, and the CARE principles. So briefly, those are that any data that's collected when you're working with local or indigenous communities should result in collective benefit, that's the C. Recognize the community's authority to control, that's the A. Uphold the responsibility to the people it represents, that's the R. And prioritize ethics rooted in indigenous values, that's the E. So those are the CARE principles. Both the links to the UNDRIP and CARE principles are provided in the slide deck that I've put in that QR code, and there's a lot more details on these that we just don't have time to go into today. And so all those resources are there so that you can learn more about these. But these are really how all these frameworks are grounded, in these resources. And so they're important to make note of. And so yeah, those resources are available. Okay, and so we're going to move through our conversation today talking about these different 4 core values. The first being integrity. And when you're thinking about integrity with local or indigenous communities, you're often thinking about their data sovereignty. So their rights to their data, their ownership of their data. And so we're thinking about our guiding question about how we move beyond standard consent with communities to actually upholding indigenous governance in our conservation tech projects. And to do that, I'm going to show you some snippets of figures that we have in the paper, the Leyden et al. Paper. And I don't intend for you to read all this tiny text. But what is useful about these is that it shows you, let me see if I get this to work. So it shows you the core value, right, this being integrity. And then what are the recommendations from the relational science model? So what does it recommend you do to sort of support that core value when you're working with communities? And then these are steps that we took. So all this stuff in bullets that's probably too small to read, but you can see it in the paper, is the steps that we took in practice to sort of address that, to implement that relational science model and that core value of integrity. And so these can be a guide or a resource for how you might do this in your own work. So these are actionable steps. These are applications. These are things that we actually did in our process. So I encourage you to look through those. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to highlight a couple from each of these values. But I encourage you to look at the paper and use that as a guide. So one of the most important parts when you're thinking about integrity is MOUs, or Memoranda of Understanding, or MOAs, Memorandum of Agreements, and data use and transfer agreements. So these provide the legal and relational architecture for data sovereignty by formally codifying in indigenous nations' rights to their data, to govern their data, to their ownership, and the ethical usage of the information when they're partnering with outside entities. And so they're really important. When you're drafting these, it's really helpful to look at examples and model language from other successful MOUs. And I've provided, again, in those slides, at the end, there's links to examples of successful MOUs and data use transfer agreements. So yeah, those resources are there. Another thing to think about is when you're thinking about communities' data is creating sort of digital placeholders for that data. And so the local context notices are one tool that you can use to actually do that. So local context is a hub that supports indigenous communities to manage their own intellectual and cultural property and data that's generated from their knowledge. And so you, as the researcher, as the scientist, right, can put a digital placeholder. A notice is a mechanism for researchers to identify indigenous collections of data, and it documents that sort of ownership of their data. And so it's a digital sort of placeholder for that information. Okay, so with that context in mind, we're going to start with our first discussion around these topics of data sovereignty and integrity.
All right, so let's do this first discussion. First, we'll go through these questions together, and then we'll give you a couple minutes to just process what these mean, write down your thoughts. You can discuss in pairs, but let's go through these first. So number one, what are some challenges you might have encountered or that you might encountered with community data ownership in your own collaborative projects, and how did you navigate them? Are there challenges related to community data ownership unique to the conservation technology community? And how can we protect community data when the technology involved, such as machine learning, is complex and unpredictable? So just take a few minutes to think about these. You can write down your ideas. Feel free to discuss amongst yourselves, and then I'll invite a few people up here to join me.
And we'll be monitoring the Whova app and the chats in there as well, and bring that into the conversation. But yeah, take a few minutes, then we'll invite y'all up.
All righty. If anyone feels brave enough to come up here, no, just kidding. It'll be an intimate discussion. Any takers to come join me up here?
Yeah, and I want to say also, like, I know it can be intimidating to come up and talk in front of a room, but this is a very small space, and yeah. Well, it's a huge space, but it's a very small group, and I really would love to hear your perspectives on these questions, because we don't have the answers, right? We're all in this together trying to navigate these new spaces and issues. And so some of these things, I don't know the answer, and I want to learn from this community about your thoughts. So I encourage you all to join us and have a conversation and hopefully not be intimidated by the chairs. Yeah.
No need to raise your hands. Just come on up if you want to join me. It'll be nice and chill. Yeah, just sit wherever you like. Sit wherever. Yep, they're all on. And we can pass them around.
And also, I know everybody's not comfortable coming up, and so there is the space on to post your thoughts. Connie, take it away.
Yes. Alrighty. Well, we can start with this. And as I mentioned before, if anyone else wants to join us up here, if I don't know, if someone says something that seems interesting to you or you have something else to collaborate, please join us. Alrighty, so any thoughts on these questions? Anything that one of you would like to get us started with? Go for it.
This may be a curveball to start with, but I'm an epidemiologist, and so I'm working with health and disease data, and so the question of co-benefits of how that intelligence is generated around wildlife disease and what implications that has around livestock management or even the downstream impacts on human health are really important, not just for communities, but for regulatory stakeholders. And so that can kind of make the decision-making philosophy a little bit more complicated. And so that's why I was interested in kind of sharing with the group is the question of co-benefits with other kind of fields or priorities.
Yeah, I would love to jump in on that real quick. So just to mention that this is a really important point, and for sake of time, we had to kind of throw a slide to the end that talks a lot about sort of what can you do within your institution to sort of respect the institution, and I'm thinking this more of an academic framework in a research institution, but still respect their sort of regulations and processes, and then also do this work well. And a lot of it is about how you can sort of lean on some of these documents as sort of best practices. So the United Nations Declaration and the CARE principles as sort of best practices, and there's some strategies you can use. It depends, this situation sounds a little more complex and complicated, but sometimes you can have the institution sort of be a collaborator in that process, and so you have to often go back and forth. We had a lot of back and forth with Colorado State University when we've done this work about this whole data sharing, data ownership piece, and their legal people got involved in the MOUs and all of that, right? So it's not, I'm not trying to say it's a simple process, but it helps us sort of break through those barriers and kind of navigate all this space in a way that hopefully leads to better outcomes. But I think I acknowledge that, yeah, there's sometimes it's just really complex. But if anybody wants to build on that or ask their own questions.
Share something else, yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned health data as well. Where I'm from, the Indigenous people are Māori, and we have the Māori data governance model, which is built off of a more core Indigenous rights document called the Te Tiriti. But the Māori data governance model was built originally for establishing standards for how to deal with Māori health data in a data sovereignty oriented way. And then it's gradually been extended to other data formats, including conservation data, and also non-Māori data. It's just a good way to deal with health data in general. But yeah, it goes into collective benefit and how you can deal with sovereignty, especially when data volumes are large and you can't, it's very difficult to actually have data sovereignty if you don't actually have the physical data. And this applies to health data, where it's if the data is stored on a database somewhere else, where is that data physically stored, and how can you ensure that the people who it's talking about have sovereignty over it if it's not in their own backyard?
Yeah, I love that point. And I also want to just point out that New Zealand seems to be really leading the way on working with Indigenous communities and seems to be like ahead of at least the US in my perspective, because I did my research in New Zealand. So I respect what they're doing there. Yeah.
Yeah, the legal framework is gradually eroding, but it's good.
Okay.
I guess this is a related question. I work on wildlife conservation science in the US, where we do research on lands that were the traditional territories of some of the Indigenous First Nations, but are no longer managed technically by them. They're more public lands, US Forest Service. Yet those Indigenous groups do have sovereign rights to their traditional territory. So it's this very complex thing where they don't technically manage or own the land in some senses, but they have access rights and sovereign rights. So we're working with a lot of First Nations groups and trying to figure out what data sovereignty, data ownership, MOUs around data look like when it's their traditional territories, but they don't live on those lands now. So I'd be curious to know how that's being addressed. I don't know if there are analogs in South and Central America, or if this is a uniquely kind of U.S. Canadian First Nations situation.
Yeah. If anybody has thoughts around, how that's happening in Central and South America, that would be great. I can't speak to that, but I mean, broadly, I can speak to the fact that this framework sort of is a broad brushstroke, right? And there's lots of nuance as to how that can actually be implemented. But I think when you're sort of drafting those MOUs and those DUDAs, it's very much a back and forth conversation, right? And so there's none of this happens quickly, and so it requires unpacking all of that, like rights holders, and all of the nuances and wrinkles of like those treaties. So I guess there's not a simple Band-Aid kind of solution there. It's more of a back and forth between, the community you're working with and, the institution that you're working with.
A specific situation that...
Yeah. But again, that doesn't mean that it's not like this architecture, this framework is sort of the starting place. It's the thought process for those conversations, right? And so...
There's to that. There's an analogy in New Zealand, but you have to legally, whether or not the land is owned by Māori, you have to legally consult the iwi who has sovereignty over the area if you're doing anything that relates to water or any native species or any humans. So. Anything.
It's interesting you point that out, because in some legal frameworks in the US that is true. So for things like EPA listings, and there's consultation with with the tribes. But I think it's when it's a little more fuzzy, where you're a scientist going out doing data collection with a smaller scale project, that it gets a little less clear what's legally required.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Great. All right. I think we're going to move on, but thank you all for your contributions. Connie, can you keep monitoring the chat? Great. Okay. So we're going to move forward and talk about now respect and humility. So I'm combining those two values together because they relate to co-production. And so we're going to first talk about respect. And so just as before, from the paper, there's the value. There is what the RSM recommends, some sort of best practices. And then here is some examples of what are the things that we actually did when we did this collaboration, right? And I'm not going to go through all these, but again, it's a framework for what you might be able to do. And I'm going to expand on the first point, which is that our collaborations were intentionally built on long-held relationships. And so that highlights the power of having community liaisons. And so Sometimes the work that I do comes from a community connecting to me, or sometimes it comes through liaisons, right? And so the example that I'm drawing from here is the work that I did with Trees, Water, and People. This is an organization that works with Indigenous communities in all of the Americas to really help them in all of their sort of community projects that intersect with conservation. And they have collaborated with the Utsche Community Forestry Association for quite a long time. And those groups together have been the liaisons for the communities that we were working in Guatemala. And so collectively, these groups sort of were our liaison, or our conduit that connected us, the sort of outside researchers, to the community. They had the trust and the long-standing relationships, and then we brought in some tools and resources that could be useful for their goals of essentially monitoring the biodiversity in their forest. And then the other tool or value I want to highlight is the value of humility. And again, so here's the recommendations from the Relational Science Model. And then here are several actions that we took to support, those recommendations. And I'm not going to go through all these, but a couple of things I want to highlight is that we ensured that the community knowledge was valued throughout this process. That's that humility piece. And then supported mutual learning through knowledge exchange. And so what that looks like in terms of valuing community knowledge, there were several things that occurred in this project. We did forest walks to learn about the community knowledge of their lands, their plants, their animals, and their interests in the forest. This reaffirmed the value of their expertise and their local knowledge. And then there were local biological researchers that we worked with the community to conduct a workshop to sort of train folks on how to use camera traps and deploy them and collect data using them. And so that was part of that knowledge exchange. And again, here we were working with local biologists and sort of with the community to develop the skill that helped support their goal of monitoring the biodiversity in their forest. And we encourage different participation of different groups to manage power dynamics. So we had sort of different community workshops and different representatives from different groups. There was a women's group, a youth group, and so they sort of organized and co-facilitated these different events in these different spaces, and that helped sort of manage some of the power dynamics in this community. All right, so that's a little bit about respect and humility, and so we're gonna, again, open it up to a conversation with everyone about some of these questions that we have.
Alrighty, so once again, we'll go over these questions together. Again, you can have some time to just think about it, and we'll get some people up here. So for our questions, number one, if a community's priorities shifts, how would or have you adopted your projects without undermining your institutional or funder requirements? When standard science and traditional ecological knowledge suggest different approaches to monitoring a species, whose expertise takes precedence in the technical design, and how would you make that determination? When introducing technology tools like camera traps or bioacoustics, for example, how have you avoided overshadowing local knowledge? And how do we design technology that can be repaired, modified, and sustained by the community long after the external researchers leave? So just think through these questions. We don't have to cover them all, whatever speaks to you, and then we'll get some people up here.
As people are thinking through, I just want to, I note that there were a couple of questions that I want to just talk about for a couple of moments. So thank you to those that shared these questions. So one participant asked, what are some examples of community data? That could be lots of things. It could be their knowledge. Often we'll do participatory mapping workshop where we ask them to sort of identify locations that are culturally significant or significant like in terms of biodiversity, like what animals exist in the landscape, what important both cultural and biological resources exist in the landscape. Sometimes we'll ask for like long histories of like oral information that is passed down. And a really important point there is that when you're creating these MOUs and data use agreements and having these conversations, Indigenous communities rightly have a lot of concerns about sharing information because there's been a long history of data appropriation and knowledge appropriation and taking and using those data without consent, and making, either publishing papers or sharing that knowledge, right? And so, again, those conversations have to happen thoughtfully around, how that data is shared, because it's often, community-owned data, and they're a little guarded, understandably, around sharing those data. And then another comment was that as an AI-driven nonprofit, we're thinking about Indigenous communities, but also the rights of animals to their data. I wonder how we can combine those two perspectives, or is there something to learn from relational frameworks as they relate to non-human species? I think that's a really awesome point, because when you move into Indigenous perspectives, not always, because I don't like to generalize, but often Indigenous peoples view the world through kinship relationships. So it's not sort of this hierarchical human and nature dichotomy. It's usually a kinship sort of relationship. And so this comment really speaks to that Indigenous knowledge, again, if you're invited into like a deeper understanding of communities and the way that they think about the world, those sort of perspectives on how they look at kinship can open up those conversations about how you can think about non-human animals in the context of this conversation. But I think if hopefully you've had some time to process some of these questions, we would love for some folks to join us and share your thoughts if you have any thoughts, so that we can learn from everyone. And also put your questions in the Whova app if you have any.
Alrighty, any takers? Anyone want to join me up here?
I really value our people that are joining us.
Anyone else like to provide some thoughts? It can also be questions if you have something that, I don't know, maybe these questions prompted other questions, join us. Yeah, let's go. And again, if anyone else wants to join in at any moment, just come right up.
Thank you.
You're up first, so.
I was looking at the fourth one and thinking about data storage again, because I just think about it a lot, and it seems like a really difficult problem to me because often there's really large volumes of data involved, especially in monitoring, and it's very difficult to store it without renting data storage from like some cloud provider. And if you do that, then no one's sovereign over the data, especially not the Indigenous people, because you're renting the data storage. So I've been monitoring a lot of audio and some visual data from a local harbor, and I've been storing the data with my university's research drive with a data sharing agreement, which is like the best we can do at the moment, but it's still not actual data sovereignty. So the ideal and what we're working towards over the long term is to set up a data storage facility on their land where they can collate all of the ecological data that's being monitored and store it themselves, and then they can do their own research on that without having to ask someone to give them access to the data every time, and so on. I think it's a difficult problem financially because it often costs a lot to store data, but it's one to think about, I guess.
That's great.
Yeah, I don't have any solutions. I'm just coming up with problems, I'm afraid.
That's okay. This is a conversation for all of it.
Okay. So yeah, the context I'm coming from is not not my specific research, but we've just been holding a workshop hearing from people doing monitoring in East Africa, where a lot of the research is donor funded, and the researchers are working with pastoralists and other indigenous groups. And a lot of the feedback they were giving us was that a lot of the technology they have for monitoring wildlife is not capturing information that pastoralists or other groups are particularly interested in, because it's tracking like the big mammals, for instance, and the donors who are providing the tech and the infrastructure, that's what they're interested in, and that's what looks good to them. But it's very difficult to capture anything that maybe relates more to the livelihoods of pastoralists when you've just got a GPS tracker on a rhino or something like that. And the other thing they kept mentioning was the fact that technology is very quickly evolving, and when they're working with these communities, they're constantly having to go back and being like, okay, we're using this platform now. Oh no, we're doing this now, and the groups they're working with are like, okay, why, kind of thing, and because it is top-down funded, it's very difficult to have those conversations beforehand to like bring in the community interest in the data that they do want to be capturing. So yeah, those are some issues we're trying to deal with, I guess, that speaks to some of this stuff.
It's very hard. Yes.
That kind of reminded me a little bit of the research I'm currently doing, just because we do want to take into consideration what are the actual interests of the community that I'm working with. Like, I have my own interests as a researcher. I want to, do occupancy modeling and things like that. The community doesn't necessarily care about that. So I think a lot of it is building those community interests from the very beginning into these MOUs, having discussions early on to see what would benefit you. And that often works for you as well, because you get more data that you can work with. But it's hard. It is hard, and I think it's a lot of discussion with the communities, but also with the higher up people, and trying to convince them, work with your institutions, like Sarah was saying before, to really convince them that this is important, and it will benefit them in the long term, I think, too. So.
Yeah, I think that question number 2 was the one that I was thinking about the most. And so the type of work that I'm doing is, it's called syndromic surveillance. And so it's like health monitoring just through observing wildlife. The rangers go out on patrols, and then they track, if there's a health problem, they input that data on a survey. And when I've been approaching kind of how we actually use that data to and put it into models, we don't have historic empirical data, and so we've approached filling that gap to actually doing the modeling and looking forward into the future with participatory methods, so like workshops and trying to quantify actually what the expectations of the stakeholders are. And so getting representation at the different levels sometimes is a little difficult, but that's how we're trying to fill the gap between kind of the standard approaches and traditional knowledge, is actually asking what the expectations are and building that into the data technology. We're not far enough in the project to actually evaluate how that participatory process is doing and generating like actionable intelligence, but that is kind of the strategy that we're trying to evaluate, is actually like the participatory inputs into the models. And that's like, I think also something that I've thought about a little bit with that stuff is like, I'm not like a tech guy, but like the user experience world of like what actually like different stakeholders are wanting. It's like, that's something that like businesses do, and it's something that has been kind of beneficial like to read about. So just throwing that out there too.
Yeah, those are really good points.
Hi, I'm András. I'm from Hungary and very far from this field, so basically a question brought me here. I'm sitting in an office doing a PhD, And in Hungary, we don't have like these local communities. But I was wondering, and this is the question to you, that I'm thinking that when you go to these communities and you want to conduct any kind of research, then there is a lot of conflict of interests. And this third question triggered this question in my mind, that how do you approach these communities and how do you motivate them to work with you, or how do you start these collaborations, because they have totally different, or I guess they can have very different interests. I just know one example, that there are somewhere in Africa, there are a small location where a lot of red-footed falcons gather once a year, and local people are hunting them and killing a lot of them to have them as food. And I'm wondering, how do you start a conversation and make them understand that this is really important to take care of these animals, but at the same time, you want to understand that those people want to feed their families. So how do you start these conversations in general?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, there's two sort of pathways that I think about. And so one of them is the approach that often I take, which is like a community has a need and I sort of connect with that community to address their need. But then you're talking about a very different pathway, which is essentially sort of, as a scientist and conservationist, you have sort of this goal, and you want to sort of make sure that when you're doing that, it's working with communities, not against them, right? And that requires, you know, having to take the community into consideration, which is, as you sort of stated, sometimes there's not, everybody doesn't have a shared interest. And so often that starts with, you know, reaching out to, like, it varies from one community to another, but often there's sort of like a contact person. In like the States, I think about like tribes will have some sort of like liaison that's like an outward-facing liaison for the tribe. That's not always true, but it can sometimes be the case. There's often some contact or point of contact, and so that could be the first person to reach out to, and, you know, just approach that conversation with a lot of humility around, you know, like, this is something that we want to start a conversation about, and, you know, want to learn more about how this could be, you know, beneficial for the community. And it's really about that humility process and that conversation to start out with. So like reaching out to those folks is a starting place. Thank you all so much for your thoughts. And then it sort of takes shape from there. But there's not an easy way to do this. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
My name is Fabiane, I'm from Brazil. So regarding this point that you mentioned, we are working with indigenous communities to measure their impact on biodiversity, positive and negative.
Mm-hmm.
And the two main questions are about the hunting and how it's controlled, and also the you know, the aspects, the animal aspects that they use for artisanias and, you know, this kind of art.
Mm-hmm.
And when we ask them about the hunt, they ask us back, so you want me to go to the next town to buy meat to eat in the village? And how is this meat affecting the environmental? Is what I'm doing is the one that is affecting the biodiversity, or all of this market? So this is something that it was really strong for us. So we have to really figure it out, what is affecting the biodiversity. So regarding the third question, this is something we are facing with them, and what we are doing is, you know, the technology we record a lot. Not only the camera traps, but also the acoustic. And what we are doing with them is, before using it, is showing them and asking the community if we can use some things that we collected. So we do the job to select, and before publishing or making it somehow available to others, we ask them if it's okay. So this is something that we kind of decided as a protocol, and we suggest to them, but it doesn't came from them to say, oh, this is the way that it has to be done. So this is something I would like to ask you as well, because sometimes the communities doesn't have the protocol, and we go and say, we do like this, it's okay for you? Is that okay to do this like that? You know, or we should go further to co-create with them this kind of protocols as well.
I mean, do you want to, or I feel, yeah,
No,
either way. I feel like, you know, any approach at, you know, working with the community is a good step, right? Like, I think anything that you can do to start those conversations and have those conversations is a good step. So even if you don't have a protocol or like an MOU or all these things outlined, just, you know, asking those questions are really important questions, right? And it's part of that sort of like, how do we have respect? How do we have humility? And it's sort of stepping back and asking those really important questions. So that's my thoughts. Connie, I don't know if you want to add more.
Yeah, just I think co-creation is honestly a really good way. I think, I don't know, like with my own experience so far, a lot of times people don't realize all the data and knowledge that they hold. And I think a lot of this comes out through discussions with people, being like, you have all of this information. How is it, like, is it okay if I use some of it? How would you like it to be used? How much of it can I share? And when you start having those discussions, I think a lot more information comes out. So I think maybe building like through workshops and just, I don't know, meetings with locals to understand a little bit more about what they would like is beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hello.
It's
Regarding a second question. I think I would look at it from a different approach. I think when these two, approaches from the communities and the scientists collide,
yeah.
I would differentiate between the like the technical aspects from the practical aspects, and I think they are not contradictory between them. So. In the technical aspects, I think that the standard science should prevail, since it is a scientific study. But that doesn't mean that you cannot take into account or the view of the community. Of course, this discussion is about that, but on how you do it. So you can, at the same time, reach both goals. The two views to characterize at the same time the same species. So I don't see it as a problem. It's just a matter of how you do it, not what you do.
Yes.
At least that is my experience.
Yeah, I absolutely love that point. And so I'm going to go back to the stage to move us along. But that actually talks about a really valuable contribution of knowledge from Micmac elder called the idea of two-eyed seeing. And so basically this is this idea that we can see the world through the lens of Western, or whatever, however you want to call it, Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems. And by doing that, you sort of leverage the strengths of both. And so science tends to be very mechanistic and detailed and in the weeds, right? And often Indigenous worldviews and knowledge are broad and on longer time horizons, and thinking about the holistic sense. And so the two are actually very complementary and can work in unison to give us a better and more complete understanding of our study system, our species, our natural resources. And so I think that was a lovely point. Okay, we're gonna wrap up with a few more thoughts. We're going to skip past our next discussion, but I just want to share some other information about this final value of reciprocity. And so there's lots of things that you can do to address reciprocity. I'm going to just talk about a couple of them. But again, here's what the RSM recommends, and then some steps that we took to give back to the communities we are working with. So I know you can't read this, but some of the things that we did was make sure that our research outcomes serve the communities. We provided honoraria to the community members for their time. We provided community meals in this process because that was really valuable to the communities we were working with. We made sure we left that technology with the community, right? We didn't take those camera traps back after we were done helping them do their monitoring project. We trained them and then left the technology there. And then for those that were interested in authorship, gave them authorship on publications. That wasn't a value to everybody, but that was a value to some community members. So lots of ways to give back. And so yeah, we did community meals, celebrations, leaving that technology in the community. And we won't have time because our first session went long, but I just want to leave you with some of these questions around reciprocity to sit with. So beyond a paycheck for a local technician or a published paper, what does that actually look like for a community partner? How do they win, right, from your collaboration? What might you do to ensure that the benefits of a project like improved biodiversity or land health remain with the community long after you're gone? Hopefully you don't leave, hopefully you stay and build collaborations, but at some point, right, grants, lifespans, and so you do have to sort of exit in some way. How do we ensure that project budgets explicitly prioritize community benefits by paying for local experts' time or investing in community-owned infrastructure like the camera traps, right, or acoustics that you put out? And if a project generates recognition, how can you share that credit in a way that's meaningful to the community who made that work possible? Okay, and so one more resource I want to leave you with is that several of you talked about evaluation in your conversations you shared. And I think that's a really important part of this process. Like I said, when we implemented this model in Guatemala, we evaluate it from the start to finish. And that's so important, because as you've all shared, we're still figuring this out. I'm still figuring this out. I don't have all the answers, not even close. I am learning very much through this process. And so that evaluation helps you learn, right? You learn and adapt. And really, you should think about it in terms of how does the community define success? That should be considered early with the community. What does success look like for them? It should be assessed frequently from their perspective. And maybe you need new metrics that you need to adopt. And so we've provided this relational science audit. Again, that's in your materials. Here's the link again. And it's just a scoring system for researchers or technologists to evaluate their alignment with the RSM and those values, right? And it's just a set of questions that you can sort of ask yourself as you're working in these types of projects. And you can use this tool at all phases, during the early stages, project design, implementation, and closeout, to hopefully see that you can score yourself, like critically self-evaluate your work, and ask yourself, am I moving in the right direction to really center these communities in the work that I'm doing? And so that's a resource. You're welcome to use it, modify it. It's probably not perfect. I'm certain it's not. But use that, modify it, and I'd love feedback if you have other ideas about how to improve it. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. I want to emphasize that relationship building is an ongoing process. It's a journey, not a destination. And we're all in different places in that journey. And so it really does require an ongoing commitment to growth, learning, and improvement. And so those resources are available for you to continue that journey. You're welcome to reach out to me in the future with any questions or follow-ups as well. And then I want you to just reflect on these. You don't have to answer any questions. This is just some thoughts as you leave this session. So what relational commitments can you strengthen in your own work? What is one concrete change based on what we discussed you can implement in an upcoming or ongoing project? Or what is one word or seed of an idea you're taking back to your home organization or institution after leaving this session? We put in the Whova, a poll about that, and it's a little word cloud. I'd love for you to, if you want to reflect on this and add some thoughts to that, that would be lovely, but no need to do that. And thank you all for your time.